On a July morning in 2009, in Hardin County, Iowa, every blade of grass in the county had turned the color of old straw. The soil cracked in hexagons the size of dinner plates. The corn was burning from the top down, and the pastures, the ones that had fed cattle in this county for 140 years, were bare. Farmers were hauling in hay from 3 states away, paying prices they hadn't seen since the oil shock of the 70s, and still watching their herds lose weight by the week. On one farm, though, on a quarter section of rolling ground off County Road SA 47, something different was happening. The cattle weren't starving. They weren't standing in bare dirt with their ribs showing. They were eating. And the woman who had planted that shade 7 years earlier was watching from the fence line, not with the look of someone who had gotten lucky, but with the look of someone who had known this day was coming. Let me tell you about Linnea Dykstra, because she is the reason this story exists, and she is different from nearly every character this channel has told you about. Linnea was 22 years old in the spring of 2002, and she had just finished her junior year at Iowa State University in Ames, studying agronomy with a secondary focus in agroforestry that almost nobody in her department took seriously. She had grown up on her father's farm, 460 acres of mixed cropland and pasture in Hardin County, the kind of farm that had been in the Dykstra family since her great-grandfather broke the ground in 1921. Her father, Jared Dykstra, was 61 years old that spring, a careful and methodical man who had farmed the same way for 38 years. He ran a cow-calf operation on about 140 acres of cool-season grass pasture, mostly Kentucky bluegrass and smooth brome grass, and he rotated his cattle through 6 paddocks on a schedule he had worked out over decades. The rest of the farm was corn and soybeans in a standard 2-year rotation. The whole operation ran on quiet competence and the refusal to do anything that hadn't been tested by time. Jared Dykstra was not a gambler. He was not an innovator. He was a farmer, and in Hardin County in 2002, those two things were considered different categories entirely. Linnea had come home for the summer with a notebook, a green spiral-bound Mead notebook that she had filled with research notes, professor quotes, extension service data, and printed tables from university studies she had photocopied in the library at Ames. She had been working with a professor named Dr. Paul Weston, who ran a small agroforestry research plot on the south edge of campus and who had spent 20 years studying the integration of trees and shrubs into livestock systems. Most of her classmates thought Dr. Weston was an eccentric, a man slightly out of step with the direction the industry was moving. Linnea thought he was the most interesting person she had ever met. Weston had taught her, and what the notebook contained in careful, handwritten columns was the argument for silvopasture, the deliberate planting of trees into pasture systems, and the tree he talked about most, the one he had been studying the longest, was Rabunia pseudoacacia, black locust, a tree that most farmers in Iowa considered either a weed or a nuisance, and that almost nobody in Hardin County would have planted in a pasture on purpose. Let me tell you about black locust, because you need to understand what Linnea understood before you can understand what she did. Black locust is native to the Appalachian Mountains, but it has naturalized across most of the eastern and central United States, and it is one of the fastest-growing hardwood trees in North America. A black locust seedling planted in good soil will reach 15 feet in 3 years. In 10 years, it can be 40 feet tall with a canopy spread of 25 feet. The wood is among the most rot-resistant of any North American species, more durable than white oak, denser than most softwoods and capable of lasting 70 years or more in ground contact without treatment. Weston's eyes light up when he talked about black locust. The thing that Linnea had written in the front cover of her green notebook in capital letters was this: Black locust is a nitrogen-fixing legume. Its root system hosts bacteria, rhizobium bacteria that pull nitrogen directly from the atmosphere and deposit it in the soil. A mature black locust stand can fix between 50 and 100 pounds of nitrogen per acre per year. That is roughly equivalent to a full application of commercial fertilizer, delivered for free every year, indefinitely, by the tree itself. The leaves and young shoots are also high in protein. Studies from Europe, where black locust is planted extensively as a fodder tree, showed crude protein content of 16 to 22% in the foliage, comparable to alfalfa. The tree leaves out in late spring and holds its leaves until hard frost. It casts a dappled, open shade that allows grass to grow beneath it. And it is drought-tolerant in a way that cool-season grasses simply are not, because its roots go down 8, 10, 12 feet into the subsoil, where moisture persists long after the surface is dried out. Linnea had drawn a map in the back of her notebook. It was a rough sketch of her father's pasture ground, and she had marked it with circles showing where she wanted to plant trees. Rows of black locust along the south and west fence lines of each paddock, with scattered plantings in the interior to break the open ground into a pattern of sun and shade. She had calculated the planting density, the spacing, the projected canopy coverage at years 5, 10, and 20. She had written down the projected nitrogen contribution per acre, per year. She had compared the cost of the seedlings, about 60 cents each from a nursery in Missouri, against the projected reduction in fertilizer cost over a 10-year period. The numbers were not ambiguous. The numbers were, in fact, quite clear. But numbers in a notebook are not the same as trees in the ground. And before she could plant anything, she had to sit down at the kitchen table with her father and explain what she wanted to do. That conversation happened on a Tuesday evening in June of 2002, after supper. Jarrett Dykstra listened, the way he always listened, quietly, with his hands flat on the table, looking at the notebook she had spread open in front of him. He looked at the map. He looked at the data tables. He looked at the cost projections. Then he looked at his daughter for a long time without saying anything. Jarrett had not gone to college. He had learned to farm from his father, who had learned from his father, and the knowledge that had been passed down through those 3 generations was real knowledge, hard-won and proven. But it was knowledge about a particular way of doing things, and what Linnea was proposing was a different way entirely. He picked up the notebook and read the nitrogen fixation numbers again. He said, "I need to think about it." That was all he said. And Linnea's mother, Enk, who had been washing dishes at the sink with her back to the table, turned around and said, quietly, without making a production of it, "She's right, you know." Then she turned back to the dishes. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Jarrett picked up his coffee cup and looked out the window at the pasture, which was green and ordinary and exactly the way it had always been. He thought about it for 2 weeks. At the end of those 2 weeks, he told Linnea she could plant trees on 20 acres, 1 paddock. The smallest one, the one on the north end of the property that had always been the least productive, anyway. The one where the grass came in thin every summer because of a shallow hardpan layer about 18 inches down. He said she could have that paddock and he would keep the cattle off it for 2 full growing seasons to let the trees establish. He said if it worked, they could talk about expanding. He said if it didn't work, they'd disc it under and reseed it and not speak of it again. He did not say it unkindly. He said it the way a careful man says things when he is taking a risk he is not sure about, with a precision that is a substitute for enthusiasm. Linnea said thank you and went to call the nursery in Missouri. Now, let me tell you about what happened when word got around, because in Hardin County in 2002, word got around about everything. The man who heard about it first and who had the most to say about it was a man named Dale Crowley. Dale Crowley was 58 years old, and he had been running the Hardin County Farm Bureau Extension Office for 22 years. He was also in the way that small communities produce such people, the unofficial authority on what was and was not worth doing in the county's agricultural operations. He held court most mornings at the counter of the Eldora Co-op, where he drank coffee and dispensed opinions with the confidence of a man who had never been wrong in his own estimation. Dale had been farming and advising farmers in this county since before Linnea Dykstra was born, and he had strong views about trees and pastures. His views were that trees and pastures were a problem, not a solution. They shaded out grass. They competed for water. Their roots interfered with tiled drainage. They harbored pests. They were, in Dale Crowley's considered opinion, what happened when a pasture was neglected, not what happened when one was managed well. A good pasture was open ground, clean grass, and cattle that could move freely in the sun. That was the model. That was what worked. That was what every successful cattleman in the county had proven over generations. He heard about Linnea's project in late June, from a neighbor who had seen the nursery truck come down County Road Tundes 47 with a load of bare root seedlings. By the time Linnea was in the field with a dibble bar planting the first row of trees along the north fence line, Dale Crowley had already told 4 people at the co-op counter what he thought about it. He drove out to the Dykstra farm one afternoon in early July. He pulled into the yard, got out of his truck, and stood at the fence watching Linnea work for a moment before he spoke. She was dirty from the knees down and moving steadily down the row, setting seedlings every 12 feet, tamping the soil around each one with her boot. She had planted about 300 trees that week. She had about 400 more to go. Dale Crowley leaned on the fence post with his arms crossed and said, "You know, those things are going to be a nightmare to get rid of when this doesn't work." Linnea kept planting. She said, "I don't plan on getting rid of them." Dale said, "Black locust spreads by root sprouts. You'll have them coming up all over that paddock inside of 5 years, and then you'll have them in the next paddock, and then you'll be spending money on herbicide trying to beat back what you planted on purpose." He said it pleasantly, the way a man says something he considers a kindness, a warning delivered before the mistake becomes irreversible. He said, "I've seen this kind of thing before. Young people come back from school with ideas that look good on paper." He paused. Paper doesn't have to grow in Iowa clay. The silence lasted about 2 seconds. Then Dale Crowley started laughing. It was the laugh of a man who was genuinely, comfortably certain that he was right and who found the alternative mildly entertaining. He shook his head and said, "Your father's a patient man." He got back in his truck and drove away. Let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever noticed what that kind of laugh actually is? It's not really about the idea being laughed at. It's about the person doing the laughing. Dale Crowley had 22 years of professional credibility invested in a particular way of understanding land. He had told hundreds of farmers in Hardin County how to manage their pastures, and every one of those pastures was open ground with clean grass and no trees. If Linnea Dykstra was right, then Dale Crowley had been telling people something incomplete for 2 decades. That is not a comfortable thing to sit with. The laugh was easier. Linnea finished planting 742 black locust seedlings on 20 acres of her father's worst pasture ground before the end of July. She staked the ones along the fence line with orange survey flags so the cattle in the adjacent paddock wouldn't push through and browse them down. She kept a record in her green notebook: the planting date, the spacing, the soil conditions, the weather. She noted which rows were on the shallow hardpan ground and which were on the deeper loam along the north fence. She wrote down her expectations for first-year growth and her projected timeline for canopy establishment. Then she went back to Iowa State for her senior year, and she waited. Let me tell you about the science, because Linnea had done her homework and it deserves to be understood. The standard model for pasture management in Hardin County and in most of the Midwest was built around cool-season grasses: Kentucky bluegrass, smooth brome grass, orchard grass, sometimes a mix with legumes like red clover or alfalfa. These grasses are productive and palatable, and they grow well in Iowa's climate for most of the year. But they have a fundamental vulnerability that every farmer in the county knew about and accepted as an unchangeable fact of life. They go dormant in summer heat. When air temperatures climb above 85 degrees Fahrenheit for extended periods, and when rainfall drops below an inch a week, cool-season grasses stop growing. They don't die usually. They go brown and dormant and wait for cooler weather. But dormant grass doesn't feed cattle. Dormant grass means supplemental feed, which means cost, which in a drought year means crisis. In a bad summer, a cow-calf operation running on cool-season grass can burn through a winter's worth of hay reserves in 8 weeks. Farmers in Hardin County had been dealing with this cycle for as long as there had been cattle in the county, and the accepted response was to stockpile hay, maintain relationships with hay suppliers in other regions, and accept that some summers were going to be expensive. What Dr. Weston's research showed, and what studies from the University of Missouri's Center for Agroforestry, from Purdue's silvopasture program, and from long-running European trials in France and Germany confirmed, was that shade from trees reduced the surface temperature in a pasture by 8 to 12 degrees Fahrenheit on a hot afternoon. That temperature reduction extended the productive season of cool-season grasses by 3 to 5 weeks in a normal summer, and potentially much longer in a drought year, because the grass under the tree canopy was not only cooler. Evapotranspiration from bare, sun-exposed soil in a heat event can remove an inch of soil moisture in 48 hours. Under a tree canopy, that same loss takes 7 to 10 days. They were functioning as a moisture retention system, slowing the drying of the soil beneath them, and keeping the grass alive and growing when everything around it was burning. Additionally, the nitrogen the trees were depositing in the soil through their root systems was building the fertility of that paddock year by year. Weston's long-term plots at Iowa State showed that pastures in silvopasture systems for 10 or more years had soil organic matter levels 20 to 30% higher than adjacent open pastures. Higher organic matter meant higher water-holding capacity. Higher water-holding capacity meant more resilience in drought. It was a system that got stronger every year, and it got stronger without inputs, without purchased fertilizer, without irrigation, and without any intervention beyond the initial planting and occasional management of the tree rows. The economics were equally direct. Linnea had calculated the cost of her initial planting at $445. The seedlings, the stakes, the flags, the dibble bar she borrowed from the agronomy department. Against that, she projected a reduction in fertilizer applications to that paddock of $40 to $60 per acre per year once the trees reached maturity, which on 20 acres was $800 to $1,200 annually. She projected a reduction in supplemental feed costs during summer slumps, which in a normal year might save $200 to $400, and in a drought year might save several thousand. She had written at the bottom of the projection page in her careful handwriting, break even on planting cost, year 3, net positive by year 5, compounding benefit thereafter. She was, as it turned out, slightly optimistic on the timeline. The trees did not establish quite as fast as she had hoped in the first year, partly because of a dry August that stressed the seedlings before their roots were deep enough to find reliable moisture. About 60 of the 742 seedlings died in that first summer. Linnea came home for Thanksgiving and walked every row, noting the survivors, marking the gaps. She replanted the gaps the following spring with seedlings from a different nursery in Indiana that had a slightly larger root mass. The survival rate on the second planting was 94%. By the spring of 2004, the trees were between 8 and 14 feet tall. The rows along the north fence line, where the soil was deeper, had put on the most growth. Some of those trees were already casting meaningful shade by mid-afternoon. The interior plantings were slower, but they were alive and growing, and the root systems were already beginning their work in the soil. Jarrett Dykstra walked that paddock with Linnea in April of 2004 and said very little, but he stopped at one of the fence line trees and put his hand on the trunk, feeling the diameter of it, and he looked up into the canopy for a moment. He did not say anything. He walked on. But Linnea noticed that he had stopped, and she wrote it down in the notebook. That summer, Linnea graduated from Iowa State and came home to the farm. She was not entirely sure at 24 years old that farming was what she wanted to do with her degree, but the project was at a critical stage and she wanted to see it through. Her father gave her a salary, a small one, enough to live on, and she took over the day-to-day management of the cattle operation while Jarrett focused on the crop ground. She started managing the rotation to include the north paddock again, now that the trees were established enough to handle grazing pressure. She kept the cattle on the paddock for shorter periods than the others, rotating them through quickly to avoid bark damage on the young trees, and she watched what happened. What happened was that the cattle went to the trees first. Every time she moved a new group into the north paddock, they walked directly to the tree rows and stood in the shade. They browsed the lower branches, locust foliage, with its 16 to 22% protein content, and then they grazed the grass beneath the canopy, which was greener and denser than the grass in the open center of the paddock. Linnea recorded the grazing patterns in her notebook. She took soil samples from under the trees and from the open areas and sent them to the extension lab. The results came back in the fall of 2004. Weston's research had predicted soil nitrate levels under the tree rows were 38% higher than in the open paddock. Organic matter was up by 1.2% in 2 years. The hardpan layer, the shallow restriction that had made this paddock the farm's least productive for decades, was showing signs of disruption from the locust root systems, which had penetrated it and begun to fracture it from below. Linnea took these results to the co-op in Eldora on a Wednesday morning in October of 2004 and showed them to Dale Crowley. She didn't make a speech. She set the lab report on the counter next to his coffee cup. He read it twice. He handed it back to her and said, "One paddock doesn't prove anything." She said, "I know. I'm not saying it proves anything. I'm saying it's working." He said, "It's been 2 years. You haven't had a drought." She said, "I know." He picked up his coffee cup. She picked up the lab report and put it back in her bag and drove home. She had not expected him to be convinced. She had written in the notebook before she went to the co-op, "He will say it's too early. He will be right that it's too early. The question is whether he'll still be saying it in 5 years." Let me tell you about the years that followed, because they are the reason the story matters. In 2005, Jarrett Dykstra gave Linnea permission to plant trees on a second paddock. 40 acres this time, the middle section of the pasture that had the most consistent soil but also the most exposure to the southwest winds that drove the summer heat across the farm. She planted it in the spring of 2005, using the same spacing and the same species mix, but this time she added a row of Siberian elm along the southwest fence line as a windbreak to protect the locust during establishment. The planting cost was $910. The second paddock was back in the grazing rotation by 2007. In 2006, the summer was hot but not catastrophic. Temperatures in the 90s for 3 weeks in July. Rainfall about 60% of normal. The north paddock, now 4 years into its tree establishment, performed noticeably better than the open paddocks. The grass under the canopy stayed green 2 weeks longer than the grass in the open ground. Linnea recorded the difference in her notebook and calculated that she had kept the cattle on that paddock for 9 additional grazing days before she had to pull them and supplement with hay. At her cost of hay that year, $82 a round bale, those 9 days represented roughly $340 in avoided feed cost. She wrote the number down. First, measurable return on avoided feed cost, not including soil fertility benefit. At the co-op that fall, Dale Crowley said he'd heard she was having some luck with her trees. He said it the way a man says something he's been told to acknowledge, but hasn't entirely accepted. Linnea said it wasn't luck. He smiled and changed the subject. In 2007, she expanded the planting to a third paddock, the remaining 60 acres of the pasture system, the south end of the property that had the best soil on the farm and had always been the most productive, open pasture. Garrett had been reluctant about this one. The south paddock was his best ground, and the idea of putting trees on his best ground felt like a risk he hadn't fully reasoned through. He and Linnea sat at the kitchen table again, 5 years after the first conversation, and she spread the notebook open to the data pages, the soil tests, the grazing records, the feed cost comparisons, the fertility numbers. Jarrett looked at the numbers for a long time. Then he said, "You decide the rotation." He meant the whole rotation, all 6 paddocks, the full cattle operation, the timing and management of everything. He said it quietly without ceremony, the way a man transfers authority when he has decided the other person has earned it. Linnea looked at him for a moment. She said, "Okay." She closed the notebook. He got up from the table and went out to the barn. Hank, who had been at the sink again, turned around. She said, "He's been wanting to say that for 2 years. He just needed to see 1 more year of numbers." The south paddock was planted in the spring of 2007, 790 seedlings, at a cost of $474. Total investment in tree planting across the full operation over 5 years, just under $1,800. And then came 2009. Let me tell you about the summer of 2009 in Hardin County, Iowa, because it was the summer that answered every question that had been left open. And it answered them in a way that left no room for interpretation. The drought began building in late May. By the first week of June, the rainfall deficit for the year was already 3 inches below normal, and the long-range forecast was showing a high-pressure ridge settling over the Central Plains that the meteorologists were calling persistent. Persistent was a word that made farmers in the county go quiet when they heard it. Persistent meant weeks, not days. By the middle of June, the cool season grasses in the open pastures across the county were already showing stress. The tips of the bromine grass were browning, the bluegrass was thinning. Farmers were making decisions about when to start supplementing, not if, but when. By the 4th of July, the decision had been made for most of them. The pastures were gone. The cattle were on hay. The hay situation was bad. The first cutting had been light because of the dry spring, and the second cutting was not going to happen at all if the drought continued. Hay from Nebraska was running $112 a bale. Hay from Missouri was $108. There were rumors of hay coming in from as far as South Dakota, but the transportation cost made it nearly prohibitive. Farmers were doing the math on their herds, and some of them were coming to conclusions they didn't want to come to. Selling cows they had spent years breeding up, liquidating breeding stock at depressed prices, because the alternative was watching them lose condition through August and September and hoping for rain that wasn't coming. On the Dykstra farm, Linnea was doing different math. The north paddock, now 7 years into its tree establishment, the rows of black locust along the fence lines had reached 30 to 35 feet in height, and their crowns had spread to create long corridors of dappled shade across the paddock. The grass beneath the trees, a mix of the original brome grass and a volunteer stand of orchard grass that had come in on its own under the canopy, was green. Not the desperate, hanging on green of grass that is barely surviving, but genuinely, substantively green. Growing, the cattle in that paddock were grazing. They were also browsing the lower branches of the locust trees, reaching up to pull the compound leaves down, getting the protein hit from the foliage that Linnea had been tracking since 2004. The soil under the canopy was moist 6 inches down. Linnea pushed a soil probe into the ground in the open center of the paddock, where the canopy hadn't reached yet, and the probe stopped at 4 inches. The ground under the trees was alive. She kept a grazing log that summer with a specificity she had not used in previous years because she understood that 2009 was the year the data would mean something to people who had not been willing to listen before. She recorded the date each group of cattle entered each paddock, the number of animals, the body condition score on entry and exit, the number of grazing days before the paddock was rested, and the amount of supplemental hay fed. The numbers she compiled by the end of August were these. The 3 paddocks with established tree systems had provided a combined total of 87 additional grazing days compared to the farm's historical average for the same period in a drought year, based on records her father had kept going back to 1978. The supplemental hay fed on the Dykstra farm that summer was 11 round bales. The neighboring farm to the east, similar acreage, similar herd size, open pasture system, fed 63 bales. At $110 a bale, the blended average of what hay cost in Hardin County that summer, the Dykstra farm spent $1,210 on supplemental feed. The neighboring farm spent $6,930. The difference was $5,720 in a single summer. on a single drought event. Against a total tree planting investment over 7 years of $1,800. Linnea wrote the numbers in the notebook in a column, the way she always did, and then she sat at the kitchen table and looked at them for a while. She was not surprised. She had been expecting a drought for years, the way a person expects something they have prepared for, not with dread, but with a kind of readiness. She was 30 years old, and she had spent 8 years building something that most people in the county had considered unnecessary at best and foolish at worst, and now the thing she had built had done exactly what she had said it would do. She closed the notebook. Jarrett came in from the barn that evening and sat down across from her. He was 70 years old, and the summer had been hard on him in the way that hard summers are hard on men who have farmed long enough to remember other hard summers and to know how bad they can get. He looked at the notebook. He said, "How'd we do?" Linnea turned it around so he could read the column of numbers. He read them. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "You were right." He said it plainly, without qualification, the way a man says something he has been working his way toward for 8 years and has finally arrived at. Linnea said, "I know." She said it without triumph, without edge. She said it the way you say something that is simply true. He nodded. He got up and went to the refrigerator and got out 2 bottles of beer and set one in front of her. They sat there for a while without talking, and outside the window the black locust trees in the north paddock were moving in the evening wind, their small leaves catching the last of the light. Now, let me tell you about what happened in September of 2009, because the story doesn't end at the kitchen table. Dale Crowley's truck came down County Road S47 on a Thursday morning in the middle of September. Linnea saw it from the barn and knew what it was before it stopped. She had been expecting this visit too, in the same way she had been expecting the drought, not with certainty, but with a kind of reasoned probability. Dale Crowley was not a dishonest man. He was a man who had been wrong about something for 7 years and who had watched that wrongness become undeniable over the course of a single catastrophic summer. And he was the kind of man who, when he had been wrong, eventually came to say so in person. He got out of the truck and walked to the fence and looked out at the north paddock for a long time without speaking. The cattle were in there moving slowly through the tree rows, grazing the green grass under the canopy. The contrast with the open ground on the other side of the fence, brown, cracked, bare, was absolute. You could not look at it and argue. He said, "I need to understand what you did here." Linnea leaned on the fence post next to him. She said, "You told me Black Locust was a nightmare to get rid of." She said it without heat, just stating the fact, the way she had written it in the notebook 7 years ago. Dale looked at the ground. She said, "I know you do." He said, "I've got 3 farmers who are going to lose cattle this fall if they don't find a way to get through the next 6 weeks. They're out of hay money and the pastures aren't coming back before frost." He paused. He said, "I don't suppose you've got any seedlings," she said. "I don't. The nursery in Missouri is sold out through next spring. But I can tell you exactly what to order, and when to order it, and I can tell you how to plant it, and I can tell you what to expect in years 1 through 10, if you want to write it down." He said, "I'd appreciate that." She went inside and got the green notebook, and she sat down on the tailgate of his truck, and she started from the beginning. Let me tell you about what happened in the years after that, because the story doesn't end at the tailgate either. The 3 farmers Dale Crowley had mentioned ordered seedlings that fall and planted them the following spring. By 2012, word had spread through the county in the way that results spread in small communities. Not through announcements or meetings, but through neighbors talking to neighbors, through men standing at fence lines. By 2014, Linnea had given informal consultations to 11 farms in Hardin County and 3 in adjacent Grundy County. The Hardin County Extension Office, Dale Crowley's office, invited her to give a presentation at the annual pasture management meeting in February of 2015. She stood at the front of the room with her notebook and a printed summary of her data, and she talked for 45 minutes about soil nitrogen, canopy coverage, moisture retention, and per-acre feed cost savings. There were 62 farmers in the room. When she finished, Dale Crowley, who was sitting in the second row, stood up. He did not applaud first the way the rest of the room did. He stood up, and then he applauded, and Linnea looked at him from the front of the room and gave him a small nod. Jarrett Dykstra was in the back row. He had driven himself to the meeting in his truck, which he rarely did anymore at 74 years old, and when the room stood up, he stood up too, and he did not sit back down until everyone else had. The Extension Service published a summary of her data in the Iowa Cattleman's newsletter in the spring of 2015. The University of Missouri's Center for Agroforestry cited her farm records in a 2016 research paper on drought resilience in silvopasture systems. Paul Weston, who had retired from Iowa State by then, sent her a letter when the paper was published. She kept the letter in the green notebook. Jarrett Dykstra died in November of 2017. He had farmed until the spring of that year when his health made it clear that the fields were going to have to get along without him. The funeral was at the Lutheran Church in Eldora, and a number of the farmers who attended had trees on their pasture ground that existed because of conversations that had started on the tailgate of Dale Crowley's truck. Nobody said that at the funeral. It was understood. Linnea inherited the farm. She was 37 years old, and she had been running it for 13 years, and the transition was less a transfer of ownership than an acknowledgement of a fact that had been true for a long time. She planted a row of black locust along the lane from the county road to the barn in the spring of 2018, 1 tree for each year her father had farmed the ground. 38 trees. She did not tell anyone why she planted them there. Let me tell you one last thing, because this is the part of the story that tells you where it's going. In the spring of 2022, Linnea's daughter, a 17-year-old named Marin, who had grown up walking the paddocks and reading the entries in the green notebook the way other children read storybooks, though, came to the kitchen table with a printed research paper from the University of Minnesota on the use of managed pollinator strips in silvopasture systems, specifically the integration of native wildflower plantings between tree rows. She had highlighted sections in yellow marker. She had written notes in the margins. She set it on the table in front of her mother and said, "I think we should try this on the south paddock." Linnea looked at the paper. She looked at the highlighted sections. She looked at her daughter's notes in the margins, which were careful and specific, and showed that the girl had been thinking about this for a while. She thought about a kitchen table in 2002, and a man with his hands flat on the table, looking at a green notebook, and the weight of what it costs to say yes to something you don't fully understand yet, she said. She did not say it after 2 weeks of deliberation. She said it right then, because she had learned what her father had taken 8 years to learn, and she had learned it faster. And that was the point. That was always the point. The green notebook is still on the kitchen table in the farmhouse off County Road S47 in Hardin County, Iowa. Marin has started adding pages to it. Her notes in a different handwriting, a different color ink, a different set of questions about a piece of ground that has been asking and answering questions for 100 years. The black locust trees in the North Paddock are 20 years old now. Their canopy coverage is over 70%. The soil under them has an organic matter content that the Extension Lab calls exceptional for the region. In a drought year, the grass under those trees stays green when everything around it goes brown. Linnea planted black locust in a grass county. They laughed. The drought came. The grass died. And the farm that was built on one woman's green notebook and one father's slow, hard-won yes is still standing, still growing, and still getting stronger every year.